The year was 1995, in the dusty town of Stonebrook, Texas, where silence stretches wider than the open plains. One summer evening, the Brooks family vanished without a trace. No struggle, no goodbye, just gone. But 25 years later, their old family dog stumbled back into town, scarred and trembling, carrying with him a secret that would shake Texas to its core. Welcome to Missing Shadows, the channel that uncovers the forgotten, the vanished, and the untold. Hit subscribe, because every shadow hides a story. Claire Donovan had learned to make peace with small certainties. The hum of her laptop in the mornings, the crowded coffee shop on South Congress where she freelanced features, the neat stack of notebooks beside her bed. At 38, she had carved a life in Austin that looked, from the outside, steady and sensible. But it was the silences that defined her, the pauses between sentences, the blank pages she couldn't bring herself to fill, the private places where the past still replayed like a scratched film. She was a reporter by trade, though not the kind that made newscasters. She wrote long-form pieces about people who slipped between the cracks, forgotten veterans, towns with dying main streets, families who stayed behind. It paid less and costs more sleep, relationships, the illusion she had once entertained that she could leave childhood behind. Claire's work was a way to look without asking too many questions about why she cared so much. Stonebrook, Texas, was not merely a memory for her. She had grown up a dozen miles from the Brooks farmhouse, rode her bicycle past their mailbox as a girl, and once watched Anna Brooks chase their dog across a yard dusted with sunlight. Claire's father had been part of the unpaid volunteer searchers, returning home with his jaw set and his palms stained with the dust of fields. When she was 13, she taped a missing poster to a telephone pole and promised, without knowing how, that she wouldn't forget. There was a restlessness inside Claire, a kind of hunger that sometimes felt like grief. She'd loved and left, dated men who called her brave, and then tired of nights spent listening to old interviews. Her colleagues called her persistent. Friends sometimes said obsessed. She didn't deny either. When the shepherd's scout stumbled back into town and faded brass of his tag spelled the Brooks name, something in Claire unclenched. It wasn't just a story. That dog was a living thread to a wound that had never healed. Quiet as she kept it, she knew, if the past was knocking, she would answer. This time, she wouldn't be the girl standing barefoot in the hallway, listening to adults hush the truth away. She would do more than listen. The Brooks family had been ordinary in a way that made their disappearance feel obscene. Daniel worked odd jobs on neighboring ranches. Marjorie taught second grade at Stonebrook Elementary and kept a tidy garden where tomatoes grew like red lanterns. Michael and Amy, 11 and 7, were the kind of kids who left their shoes by the back door and plastered refrigerator magnets into mosaics on the kitchen. Their dog, Scout, belonged to every child who wandered their yard. That summer of 1995 arrived with the blistered heat Stonebrook prided itself on. Late July, cicadas everywhere, the highway glimmering with heat off the asphalt. One evening, the Brooks porch light flickered as usual and then was dark. The next morning, neighbors found their swing empty, a bowl of cereal at the table drying into a crust of sugar, and the children's backpacks still packed by the back door. No car tracks on the gravel driveway pointed away. No signs of force. No witnesses who could say they had seen anything but a house that had gone. Mute. Claire was 13 when the town changed its rhythm. Her father, a weathered man who'd spent his life on tractors, showed up at home the night the searches began with dark hollows under his eyes. He had looked older in the way grief ages people, jaw-set hands, forever smelling of dust. He went out each morning with a flashlight and a magnet in his pocket. The quiet sort of man who expected answers and didn't get them. The initial search drew law enforcement from the county and neighboring jurisdictions. At first, theories moved like cattle. A runaway, a family staged a disappearance, kidnappers, a tragic accident. The local sheriff's office banged out reports. The FBI came for a week and left, promising leads that collected like dust. People prayed. People argued. People left flowers on the mailbox. When the trail ran cold, those promises and prayers hardened into long months of stunned denial. For Claire, the vanishing became a map of small betrayals and sudden absences. Friends moved away. Her parents stopped answering certain questions. Adults lowered their voices in the grocery store. She learned early that silence can be its own kind of damnation. The town needed to sleep again, and sleep required forgetting. Every little thing reminded her. Anna's favorite lullaby, drifting from a neighbor's porch years later. The way Scout's paw prints were once found at the edge of a dried-up creek. The years layered, each promising relief that never came. Claire read every archived article, pleaded with old deputies for case files, held onto yellowed flyers because paper was sometimes the last thing that kept memory from vanishing entirely. When the dog returned thin, his ribs visible, one ear torn, his tag still told a name. To Claire, that tag wasn't a piece of metal. It was an accusation. It meant someone or something had been holding onto that family story and was ready to hand it back in pieces. She realized the past hadn't slept. It had been waiting for a wrong to be righted, for questions to be asked with a voice that wouldn't soften. The wound didn't just reopen, it began to thrash. 25 years of small mercies and quiet avoidance couldn't hold together against one living thing that had survived whatever took the Brooks family. Claire could hear the old, hollow echo of that summer and knew this time she would not let it be dismissed. On a low-slung morning, thick with the smell of hot oil from the diner, Sheriff Bill Harlan's phone blinked with an anonymous tip. A pickup driver near County Route 9 had nearly struck a mangy shepherd limping along the white line. The driver pulled over and saw the dog's collar. A dented brass tag with the name Brooks stamped in block letters and the single name. Scout. Word spread faster than a summer storm in Stonebrook. It's the way small towns pulse. One neighbor tells another at the feed store. The barber mentions it, a pasta size over it after service. By noon, a crowd gathered at the veterinary clinic where Scout lay sedated, his breathing shallow. The dog's eyes pale and bright seemed older than his body allowed. Claire's phone vibrated with a single image from an old classmate, Scout under a fluorescent light. The tag legible even in a blurred photo. Her stomach dropped in a way she recognized as a summons. She left her desk in Austin without thinking of deadlines. The highway swallowing miles until the green turned to scrub and the skyline narrowed to the low, flat horizon of Cinabra. At the clinic, the air smelled of antiseptic and worry. Sheriff Harlan stood off to the side, his hat cupped in his hands. He looked different. The easy, gruff reassurance of the younger deputy had been sanded away by years of small compromises and older lies. "You knew them?" he asked without preface. Claire nodded. "I used to ride by their house as a kid. I remember their pecan tree. Scout used to chase my bike." The words raked at her like wind through old pages. Harlan handed her an envelope with a photo inside. It was a night shot of the Brooks farmhouse lights, glowing behind what looked like newly replaced curtains. "Someone's been hanging around the property," he said. "We found footprints near the back in the morning. Not fresh holder, but not as old as the boards." The town was restless. Sidewalk conversations developed corners, people leaning in to trade fears. Radio hosts joked that the supernatural had moved back into East Texas. But Claire felt the gravity of something more precise, less fanciful. Scout's return was a line into a thread someone wanted them to tug at it. At the motel where she spent the night, a folded note waited on her windshield when she returned from a late-night coffee run. 3 black words, hurried and unmistakable. "Ask about Anna." It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. She thought about Anna all night. At 7, Anna had been a spark. Pigtails, scuffed knees, a habit of humming to herself on the swing. The idea that someone had intentionally pivoted attention to Anna felt like a key turning in a lock. It suggested not accident, but design. Someone sifting through the town's memories, placing stakes where they knew prying hands would go. Then the email arrived to no sender. A subject line that read simply, "Look again, inside." A single attachment, a grainy video clip of a dim basement. The video jittered, and through the green-tinted night vision, Claire made out a small figure sitting against a concrete wall, rocking. A lullaby hummed faintly, the same tune neighbors had always said Anna liked. The hairs along Claire's arms rose in a painful recognition. She took the clip to Sheriff Harlan the next morning. He scowled, pushed the file away. "Could be anything," he muttered. "Could be someone fucking with us." Claire's reply was blunt. "Or it could be the only proof that one of them is still alive." Harlan's jaw worked, and for a second she saw the man who had once stood at her father's shoulder during search, Petiza, man whose choices might have been intended to protect. Then he said, softly and deliberately, "You don't want this, Claire." The sense of inevitability tightened. The dog had returned. The town's old wound was bleeding. Someone was talking to them in fragments, daring Clara's King, the one person who never let such stories die, to listen, to follow, and finally to bring what had slept in Stonebrook's red earth into the light. Claire's first move was to the courthouse, a squat brick building with a flag that hung limp in the heat. Records, she thought, if anything about the Brooks was to be understood, it would be through what had been written down and then left unread. She walked through the county clerk's office like a woman doing penance, pulling public records, property deeds, and the original incident reports from 1995. Most of it was procedural. The language officious, investigation ongoing, no evidence of foul play, case status, inactive, but in the margins attached to one old deputy's report, a sticky note smudged and nearly illegible said Honor saw her near tracks, and a later note, report suppressed. Suppress. The word felt like a hand slamming a lid on a pot. Something inside was sealed and under pressure. Claire began to ask questions she had been taught to avoid as a child. Who had wanted the lid closed, and why? She called Eli Brooks, Daniel's younger brother, who still worked the ranches and lived in the family house 2 farms down. Eli was blunt and guarded. "We all got weird letters," he said when they met at the feed store. "Pictures, mostly of the house with lights on. We thought it was a joke." He told her about late-night footsteps near the barn, about a neighbor who'd been moved to tears at the sight of Scout, and about the whispers that ran like a current under the town's presentable surface. Claire pushed further, and Eli's shoulders slumped. He admitted a secret she'd not expected. On the night the Brooks disappeared, he had found tiny footprints leading from the back door toward the old rail spur. "Little ones," he said. "I thought it was one of the kids." Next day gone, he had not told the sheriff then, because he'd been afraid the sheriff would think he'd been involved. "I was Eli swallowed. I thought I could fix it myself." When the name Anna kept echoing in her head, Claire put a call into the state archives. A clerk found a forgotten article describing a witness who'd reported seeing a small girl on the tracks 10 days after the family vanished. The sheriff at the time, a man now retired and living with a slow stoop, had dismissed the report in an offhand interview, saying, "Kids wander." But the file stamped with that interview had an addendum scrawled in a deputy's hand. "Follow up unnecessary." The question mark made Claire feel foolish. Who decided what was unnecessary? Who got to weigh a child's life and set it aside? As Claire dug, the town's polite reserve frayed. An old neighbor called to warn her to leave it be, that some families had gotten bitter when old secrets were dragged out. Others approached with gratitude, handing her faded family photos and names of relatives who had moved away. Someone slid an old VHS tape into her bag at the diner, murmuring, "Might mean something to you." The tape was labeled in a messy, adult scroll, "Search, Day 3. It showed people picking through a dry creek bed, metal detectors sweeping, a deputy pausing to rub his eyes. For one small moment in the footage, a woman, Marjorie Brooks, stood at a distance and turned toward the camera, a look on her face Claire could not forget. It was the same face Claire had carried all these years. A woman who trusted too much. Resistance came from the top. Sheriff Harlan, visibly uncomfortable, shut down one of her attempts to interview former deputies. "You're stirring up old pain," he told her. "We don't need this." He warned her about anonymous emails and late-night calls, the kind of threats that arrive with the silence of a town that prefers to forget. But Claire had stopped pretending she could be gentle with the past. Gentle hadn't saved the Brooks. As she pressed, the clues multiplied in ways that felt less accidental and more deliberate. There were the pictures of the house with lights on taken from different angles, always at night. There were the footprints Eli described that didn't match any local shoe prints. There was the basement video in the anonymous email, grainy but unmistakable in its mood, and a new note left on her car windshield. "Check the pecan tree." Claire went at dusk, when the light thinned and the world seemed more willing to show its edges. The pecan tree loomed like a sentinel, its roots knotted and old. Beneath it she found a scrap of cloth buried shallowly in the dirt. It was a child's shoe ribbon, threaded with long-ago mud. Her hands shook as she held it. The ribbon was small enough to have belonged to Anna. Being the one who wouldn't let it go had its costs. Her editor called and asked if she was doing a nostalgia piece, as if stories of vanished families could be folded into soft features about hometown resilience. Her friends asked why she couldn't just let sleeping ghosts lie. Claire realized she had to move faster than judgment could settle, faster than the town could congeal its defenses. Every moment she waited, someone else had time to bury another scrap of proof. And yet there were moments of fragile help. A high school teacher from Stonebrook handed over a box of old yearbooks. A retired postal worker produced a stack of undelivered flyers he had kept in his truck for decades. The small kindnesses seeped into Claire's chest, giving her courage that bordered on recklessness. She was no longer only following a story. She was following a promise she'd once made to a younger self who refused to forget. The trail was messy and half-finished, but it moved. Each discovery, footprints, a scrap of cloth, a suppressed report, pushed her deeper into a place some had called better left alone. Every new clue dimmed the thin comforts the town clung to, and at every step, Claire felt something like inevitability, that if she kept pulling at this thread, whatever was sewn into Stonebrook's past would unravel in ways no one could predict. Claire had expected denial, petty lies, the usual shielding that small towns perform when grief intersects with pride. She had not expected the sense of a single, deliberate hand across many years, someone who'd been moving pieces quietly while the town slept. She had not expected Sheriff Harlan's shadow to stretch so long into the past. The twist came when an elderly woman, Mrs. Alvarez, who had been a neighbor to the Brookses, appeared at Claire's motel door with a shoebox of things she'd found in her late husband's attic. "He was a picker," she said, voice small. "But he kept things that didn't make sense to him. Might make sense to you." Inside lay a collection, a handful of hairpins, an old Boy Scout patch, and a folded scrap of paper with a name and a number. The name was familiar, Daniel Brooks. The number was newer than the rest, scrawled in blue ink. Claire dialed the number on instinct. A recorded voice answered an automated line for a debt collection agency. Her thumb froze on the call button. Debt. The town had whispers about land sales in the 90s, about liens rolled into land trusts. Similar names began to surface in files Claire hadn't expected to see. Contractors who vanished after a single job. A property developer who had once offered the Brooks a buyout for their acreage, and a thin, bureaucratic trail that smelled less of accident and more of leverage. Eli sat with her under the neon buzz of the diner as the sun set. "My brother wasn't a man of many secrets," he said with a slow pull on his coffee. "But he kept a ledger. He owed someone. When he couldn't pay, people started asking." He swallowed. "I think someone wanted the land." The Brooks said no. After that, things got weird. Claire felt the floor of the mystery tilt. What had seemed supernatural might instead be the gravity of greed. But greed alone didn't explain the basement video, the careful suppression of the tracks, the whispered orders to forget. There was something else, older and deeper, that had pushed people to collude in silence, fear. And then a letter arrived at her hotel, unmarked, with handwriting that trembled like a leaf. Inside, a single line. He took her because they threatened the farm. No signature, no return, just an accusation. Her mouth went dry. She confronted Sheriff Harlan with the new line of reasoning: land, debt, threats. He sat across from her with his hat in his hands like a man who has been awake too long. "We were under pressure," he said, voice low. "Not always from outside. From men who had money and time and patience. We wanted to protect what we could." He shifted, eyes closing. "If people with pockets that deep decide you're a problem, what do? You hide someone who matters. You push the danger away." The implication made Claire sick. What if the Brooks family had been made into a liability, hidden so they would stop asking questions? What if On a Little Honor had become a bargaining chip, moved from house to house under supervision, not rescued but relocated to keep the peace? A younger deputy, burned by guilt and the years, came forward with a name, a contractor named Mason who had once promised to modernize parts of Stonebrook, but who vanished from public view when trouble followed. Kittrell's ledger showed purchases connected to the Brooks property, and an intermediary's name tied him to a series of men who kept accounts in off-the-books, ledgers, and safe deposit boxes. It was a map of influence that reached into the sheriff's office in subtle ways: donations, favors, quiet pressure to close the case. But the most brutal twist was human in its simplicity. Sheriff Harlan had not been merely complicit through fear. He had made a choice he thought was protection. He had hidden Anna. When Claire pressed him, after a long, bitter night of drunk confessions and cold coffee, Harlan admitted something worse than cowardice. He had known that the men who wanted the Brooks land would return for trouble if the family remained outspoken. He had taken Anna off the books, moved her to a safe house with a foster couple who were promised money and told to never speak of the child. He had convinced himself it was necessary. He had become judge, jury, and guardian in a world where the law was thin. "You can't just undo 25 years, Harlan whispered. "I thought I was buying time." I thought his voice dissolved. The depth of the betrayal left Claire reeling. Not only had powerful men tried to buy a piece of the Brooks life, but the very office meant to protect citizens had been compromised, allegedly by fear, maybe by greed, and almost certainly by the ugly arithmetic of both. The town's institutions were not bastions of truth. They were negotiators with consciences that could be rented. Worse, the revelation suggested someone else had kept Anna more recently, someone who had honored the bargain and then perhaps rejected it. The anonymous emails, the staged photos, the basement video, were they pleading, taunting, or warning? Claire had expected to find one culprit. Instead, she found a knot: greed, fear, shame, and protection tangled until no one could tell where care ended and cruelty began. The Brooks hadn't vanished into nothingness. They had been pulled into a human calculus with consequences that rippled outward for decades. This was the twist. The town's sleep had not been natural. It was bought. And now that the purchases were being tallied, some of the receipts were turning up in Claire's hands. The night Claire decided to stop letting the past be negotiated in whispers, the sky over Stonebrook was a hard iron slate. She'd spent days gathering evidence, and more nights trying to read between faces parishioners who bowed their heads too quickly at church, ranch hands who averted their eyes at the mention of Kittrell, deputies who left doors locked tight. Her choices narrowed to two ugly possibilities: pull Anna out into the noise and risk destroying her fragile identity, or let Harlan's secret keep her safe at the cost of the town's conscience. Claire chose truth. She arranged a meeting at the old feed mill with Eli and a young deputy who'd finally risked his job to hand over Kittrell's ledger. The pages were a ledger of influence, checks written in folded sums, names half smudged, dates that lined up with key events around Stonebrook. It was all the proof she needed to connect the dots. At the same time, a tip sent at midnight led her, unexpectedly, to an abandoned trailer 2 miles off. County Route 81 that had lights on the night photos were taken. Inside the trailer was a room set up to be lived in, blankets folded, a small collection of toys hidden under a mattress. In a locked closet, a calendar from a few months ago had a single date circled repeatedly. On a table lay a photograph. Anna, older now, hair pulled back, eyes wary, as they stood in the cramped space. Claire felt the ground door, the idea of a tip. Someone had been keeping her under watch. Someone had chosen to let her be partly free, moving between safe houses, a life lived the realization that Anna had been alive and near, often, for years, shoved a sharp blade into Claire's chest. They had a name for the person they believed was protecting Anna. A woman who'd appeared on and off in local records, Ruth Carter, who had been paid quietly to care for the child and told never to speak. Ruth, they learned, had grown tired of secrecy. She'd started leaving pieces of evidence to people she trusted: photos, notes, The maddeningly ambiguous basement clip, hoping someone would pull Anna out gently when the town could no longer pretend harmlessness was safety. Confrontation was inevitable. Claire, Eli, the deputy, and a small team approached Sheriff Harlan's house before dawn. The sky a pale smear. Harlan opened the door as though he had been waiting for the reckoning. His face was ashen, and he did not try to deny their entry. "You promised you'd keep her safe," Claire said. "Not a question, but a hammer. You used my silence, our forgetting everything. Where is she now?" Harlan's shoulders slumped as if the weight had finally landed. "I never thought I'd be called to answer," he whispered, but she was moved. "I didn't want to scare her. I wanted to save what was left." They moved like an indictment into the place. Ruth had occupied an old guest house behind an abandoned motel, a quiet, cluttered nest. Ruth met them with a face full of bruised hope. When Anna stepped forward from the back room, she was a woman shaped by careful omission, polite, guarded, eyes that flicked two corners as though expecting someone hiding. The moment of reunion was not cinematic. Anna didn't collapse into Claire's arms or scream with relief. She stared, measured, and then asked hollowly, "What happens now?" Her voice was older than her years, but ringed with a child's uncertain timbre. Claire felt everything she had been carrying: eigen, righteousness, exhaustion, hitched to a single, aching responsibility. The urge to expose, to name, to force justice collided with a gut-level fear. Revealing Anna might shatter her. Would the exposure save her, or turn her life into another kind of public wound? Ruth whispered under her breath, "I thought hiding her was protecting her. I was wrong and right, both." As deputies cuffed a man whose ledger carried enough weight to make him move in circles far beyond Stonebrook. The darkness around them hummed with a fragile, dangerous possibility. The people who'd sold silence for comfort were beginning to squirm under scrutiny. Kittrell's network tightened like a net, and men who had once been untouchable began to look small. But the climax cracked wider than anyone expected when Anna, suddenly and with a clarity that terrified them, spoke a single thing that landed like a verdict. "I don't want to be a story." It stopped Claire cold. The heat of her pursuit met the cold edge of Anna's autonomy. She realized then that the climax of her story was not the exposure of wrongdoing, but the messy, human moment where the rescued might not want to be saved in the way others imagined. The sirens that followed, the arrests made, the ledger's secrets spilled into county files, these were only the legal consequences. The truer fracture was the one that opened inside everyone there. Between the desire to right a wrong and the need to respect a life that had been built around secrecy. Claire understood then that the breaking point was not just the revelation of crimes, but the moral wreckage that followed. After the arrests and press, Stonebrook moved through a slow and complicated unwinding. The county filed charges that reached into the quiet rooms of bank accounts and property transfers. Men who traded favors for silence were named in courtrooms under fluorescent lights. Some pleaded, some clammed up, and some left town with their reputations folded tight around them like a bandage. Claire's, articled the one she had been, gathering details for in the margins of motel, receipts and feed store conversations. In a national outlet, a careful, measured narrative that centered on Anna's right to choose and on the town's responsibility to remember without consuming. She avoided exposing every place Ruth had hidden Anna. She withheld names when they could cause harm to a fragile life. She had learned, in the barn and the trailer, that truth had edges that could slice. and restraint could be a form of care. Anna did not immediately reintegrate into the world like a character stepping out of a book. She moved instead through stages: anger at the people who made choices for her, relief that her story was now out of the dark, anxiety at being noticed. There were days she refused to leave the guest house Ruth had prepared, and other days when she sat for hours on a bench under the pecan tree and simply watched the sky. Claire visited as often as she could, bringing coffee, bringing silence when needed. They talked about small things, at first a recipe, the feel of rain on a tin roof, until Anna could say, once, without flinching, "I remember the swing." The town felt rueful. Some neighbors avoided Claire in the grocery store, embarrassed as though silence had been contagious and they had been infected. Others thanked her, eyes rimmed with tears, relieved that the story had been handled gently. Sheriff Harlan resigned with a statement that bowed under the weight of his choices. He said he had tried to protect the vulnerable, and he apologized for the ways that protection had failed. Legal fallout spread, but it was not the only consequence. There were quiet reckonings between neighbors who had once smiled without knowing. People who'd been complicit through fear, greed, or both, found themselves with fewer places to hide. Some sought forgiveness and did the long work of making restitution. Others chose the hard silence of exile. For Claire, the aftermath was both less and more than she had imagined. She did not walk away unscarred, nor did she leave with any sweet sense of triumph. The story had taken from her something, perhaps the last of her illusions about tidy endings, but it gave back something else, a steadier heart, a less naive understanding of how the world's wrongs could be both structural and intimate. She had pulled a thread that untied a knot. She had also learned that sometimes a tug does not instantly restore what was lost. Anna left Stonebrook eventually, choosing an address of her own in a city far from the Texas plains. She asked Claire to help with the practicalities: phone calls, a safe deposit box, a therapist with a quiet waiting room. Claire agreed, and their relationship grew in the slow, deliberate way of people who share a history that reads like a map of survival. Stonebrook's pecan trees still shaded the porches in summers to come. Children played where Scout once chased them. People hung high school banners for parades and painted mailboxes. The town's heartbeat resumed a different rhythm, one with a new bandage and a memory sharpened by truth. The Brook's name was no longer a whisper at church potlucks, but a story with faces, with a dog tag pinned to a corkboard at the vet's office as evidence that life sometimes returns in odd, stubborn ways. Claire returned to Austin with a file of photos, audio clips, and notes. She saved Scout's worn brass tag in a small tin labeled with the date she had published her piece. She drove sometimes back to Stonebrook to see Anna from a distance, to watch the way sunlight fell on the porch and to feel that hard, strange satisfaction that comes with the doing of a thing you were afraid to start but had to finish. Closure, she discovered, isn't a single door closing. It's a series of small, imperfect locks being reset. People forgive in pieces. Justice moves at its own slow velocity, and those who have been missing sometimes return in ways that require everyone around them to be kinder, quieter, and more patient. Truth doesn't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it shuffles home, limping on tired paws, bringing with it fragments of the lives it left behind. Stonebrook learned that secrets can be bargains struck in fear, and that bargains eventually unravel. Claire learned that uncovering is not always victory. Sometimes it is stewardship, listening to what survivors need, choosing which details to tell, and allowing a life to heal on its own terms. In the end, the past doesn't vanish into dust. It waits patiently, like a dog at the gate, until someone remembers to open it.